To a significant extent, success in IGCSE English language is about nailing exam technique as much as how good you are in English. But it's hard to nail exam technique when CIE keep changing the format of their papers. At the time of recording, there were very few past papers out there. This is where Schofield on Shakespeare comes in. I've plundered the archives of CIE to find 3 texts used in the older 0500 specification. I've taken text A from the core paper of the summer 2012 exam and text B and C from the extended paper. I've edited a few questions from the core paper and written some of my own to recreate questions 1A to E, which also required some tweaks to the original passage. Question 1F is essentially the first part of the old question 3. I've written question 2A to C myself, and both question 2D and question 3 are almost identical to the old question 2 and 1, although there have been some changes to the weighting of the mark scheme for question 1, which I have implemented. It doesn't really matter whether you follow that or not, but the crucial point is this. This is as close as you're going to get to a genuine past paper for the new 0500 0990 specification. So get stuck in and stay tuned. You're watching Schofield on Shakespeare.
Le grammatiche sono tante.
E poi non gosto se dà per non si mordeva.
Não vês que sou eu?
How should you approach this video past paper? Well, the first thing to bear in mind is that it would be easier to work from an exam style paper copy with both question and insert available. Please email me at schofieldonshakespeare@gmail.com if you would like to have this. However, this isn't essential as all inserts and questions will be shown on screen and you will be able to toggle between them. The second point to consider is timing. Paper 1 is time pressured and it's all very well nailing the technique for different sections if ultimately you don't get onto the final bullet points for question 3. I will only go through the mark scheme and my answers to each section after sharing all questions and inserts with you. And so my suggestion is that you should aim to complete the whole paper in approximately 2 hours of a single sitting. Therefore, you should ensure that your exam technique is sound before attempting any of these questions, or indeed continuing to watch this video. My individual videos on different parts of the paper can help you with this.
So with this video, texts and questions will automatically appear at 5-second intervals. Press pause to read each section through before writing down your own answers. You will need to toggle back to the extracts to answer the questions properly, of course, but this will be easy to do knowing that each slide is shown for 5 seconds. Generally, the passages will be divided up into 3 slides so that the font isn't too small to read. Enough from me, just to reiterate that every slide will advance every 5 seconds until the end when I will present the mark scheme, my own response, my analysis of how my responses meet the mark scheme. Press pause to start reading passage A and to start the practice paper. The second part of the text will be shown in 5 seconds time and so on.
How did you get on? Now, here's the really important part, reflecting on what you did well and where you can improve. It's time to see my answers and the mark scheme.
The first question is intended to be straightforward. You don't need full sentences, and you can just copy the words from the text. I suspect that in the real exam, there will be just 2 possible answers required to get the mark. But here, you can get any 2 from the selection on screen to be credited. Press pause to mark your work. Note with 1B that the mark scheme expects you to explain 2 strands to the phrase, and that each strand is given on a separate bullet point. In other words, you won't get the 2 marks if you simply develop an idea about one of the words in the phrase, rather than move on to the other word or words. Press pause to mark your work, up to 4 marks available here. Don't be overly generous, the examiner won't be. The key with this kind of question is making sure that your 2 points are clearly different. 2 overly similar points is likely to get you just the 1 mark. Press pause to mark your work. Fairly straightforward. Pause to mark. Potential points for this. Again, 3 marks equals 3 separate points. You need to make sure that you are using your own words to show an understanding of the passage. Also make sure that you are specifically answering the question rather than retelling the text. Press pause to mark your answer. Notice for this question that you need to do a little bit of reading between the lines to ensure that you are sharply focused on the question. The passage states that some species would fly up to 10,000 miles in order to reach warmer climes. However, writing this in your own words wouldn't get you the mark. You then need to bring it back to the question to state that stopping them doing this is morally wrong. Time to mark your work, up to 3 marks available. Let's now move on to passage B and 1F, the summary question. A few principles here are that you need to be concise, very clear, and that you shouldn't include small details from the text, because therefore you're not summarising. And yes, this might result in your writing sounding a little boring. The mark scheme includes some possible points, which you might summarise from the text. Have a read through these points. I normally ask my pupils to cross-reference the points they have used in their response with those shown here. Of course, marks are not awarded on a per-point basis, but it is nonetheless a useful exercise. So count and compare the number of points in your response with those on screen. Press pause now. However, what is more important is the marking grid, in which the examiner has to make a judgment about the overall effectiveness of your summary. There are most marks awarded for your reading. The best responses will clearly show to the examiner that you have thoroughly understood what the passage is about. The best responses will include a wide range of points. I'm always asked, how many? This is a tricky one, but I would suspect you need around 8 or 9 summarised concisely to get into that top band. Press pause if you'd like to read through the mark scheme in more detail. In particular, note the descending adjectives. Top band has thorough understanding, 7 to 8 marks competent understanding, 5 to 6 reasonable, 3 to 4 some understanding, and 1 to 2 limited understanding. Five marks are also allocated for the quality of your writing. Note the writing bar is lower for this question compared to, say, paper 2. In paper 2 for directed writing, the top band wants you to have a wide range of sophisticated vocabulary precisely used and spelling, punctuation and grammar almost always accurate. Not so here. Here we are after clarity, concision, and in terms of spelling, punctuation and grammar, it is mostly accurate rather than almost always accurate. So that mightily irritating missing apostrophe may not prevent you from getting the full 5 marks here after all. Read through and possibly even memorise the writing mark scheme for 1F. Press pause to do this. Before you make a judgment and allocate yourself marks out of 10 and 5 for your response, here's what I wrote. The sea takes up the majority of the Earth's surface. In places, it is deeper than the world's highest mountains. Sadly, partly due to its extraordinary depth, the sea is used by some wealthier countries to get rid of waste, some of it contaminated. The sea contains a range of ecosystems, many of which humans know nothing about. There are numerous sea creatures which would defy belief, yet some have been sighted by sailors. Some sea creatures are enormous and far heavier than the largest land mammals. The sea also contains significant quantities of precious metal. The sea has the power to destroy and wreck ships so that they appear to vanish, although some past stories have been incorrect. Nonetheless, we continue to be excited by such stories, and the sea is considerably more powerful than any ship. One magical feature of the sea is the way it can become completely calm following a storm. It can even appear completely white on the surface. However, it is vulnerable to abuse by humans. Coral reefs and ancient undiscovered cities need to be protected. Out of interest, how many of my points appear within the indicative content of the mark scheme? And you'll be pleased to hear that I didn't look at this before writing my response. So it looks like I've included 9 points from a possible 12, although it strikes me as though I may have included a few details which the examiner may deem irrelevant. For instance, perhaps CIE see the question as an opportunity to write positively about the sea and its amazing features. Thus, is it irrelevant to talk about how it can be used negatively by humans? Crucially, the response needs to be concise, clear, and predominantly in your own words. I've used 4 short paragraphs, much easier to read and mark than one bumper single paragraph. And in this opening paragraph, an analysis of sentence length may be insightful. 10 words, 10 words, 24 words. Shorter sentences always aid clarity and concision. However, note the commas within the 3rd sentence, which make it much easier to identify the main clause and main points. I always think connectives are useful for structuring your response. I use nonetheless and however. See what I've done there? Don't be afraid of restating key words from the question to show that you're sharply focused on the task, rather than just summarising the passage as a whole. A few of my pupils fell into this trap during initial practice questions. Time now for you to make a judgment call about your own response. Press pause to give yourself a mark out of 10 for reading. And a mark out of 5 for writing. Question 2 now, which kicks off with what I call the reverse synonym questions. They have found a synonym for you. You have to find the original from the text. The key point here is not writing too much, only include the equivalent to the underlying phrase from the text. If you write more than this, I suspect the examiner will gleefully refrain from giving you the mark. It's fine if you include the word in brackets within the mark scheme, but no more, please. Press pause to mark 2A, 1 and 2. Three and 4 now. Press pause to mark. Now time for 2B, in which you need to show a precise understanding of 3 words within a short extract. You need to use your judgment here, as of course there are other possible answers. However, the key principle is that you show a precise understanding of the words, not a vague one. For instance, these kind of answers, big, nearby, lives, would clearly be too vague or not quite right. Press pause to mark your work. A total of 3 marks available here. To C now, the key here is to choose a sufficiently interesting quotation so that you can write 3 sentences about it. 3 marks, 3 sentences. Note the general guidance in the mark scheme. To get the full 3 marks, your explanation needs to be comprehensive. Here are some suggested quotations and notes. Have you used one of these quotations? If not, does your quotation still enable you to provide a comprehensive explanation of the fisherman's attitude towards life on the island? Press pause now to make a judgment call on your piece, with up to 3 marks available. Now question 2D. One of the fundamental errors 1 or 2 pupils make here is referring to the wrong paragraph or paragraphs. Indeed, a very bright past pupil of mine did this in his actual IGCSE, as we found out when we requested his exam paper. The examiner gave him 0 for his response, as none of his quotations came from the correct paragraphs. This explained why he didn't get the grade 9 of which he was capable. Let's start with the suggested quotations and points for paragraph 4. Did you use 3 of these quotations? Are your quotations as interesting as these? Press pause to read through and ponder. Now for the possible points for paragraph 7. Press pause to read these through and ponder. Some of my pupils have asked me whether reproducing these ideas within full sentences would be sufficient to get the full 15 marks. The answer is not necessarily. Indeed, some of these CI notes are very brief, and clearly grade 9 candidates will be saying more and developing more. Remember, just as for question 1F, question 2D is marked based on a grid. This grid. Keywords within the top bands include judiciously selected language. You have deliberately picked out the more interesting, complex quotations. You have honed in on any similes, metaphors, or examples of personification. Add meanings and associations. You have defined more complex words where necessary and explored their effect within the context. Tackles imagery with some precision and imagination. You are really precise when exploring those similes and metaphors and have something imaginative to say very occasionally, which doesn't sound far-fetched or over-analytical. Notice the overall sense for each reading level. the best have wide-ranging discussions. Then we go down within level 4 for explanations, then satisfactory attempts, then communicate less well, and finally the ignominy, rarely relevant. Before you make a judgment call on your piece, here's what I wrote on the first paragraph. Notice how I begin with the quotation before providing my analysis. This saves time and makes it easier for the examiner to mark. Remember, they will also have quotation notes within the indicative content of the mark scheme. I write, full of menace. Adam has a sense of foreboding about the dense cloud above the sea. He feels as though it is threatening a destructive storm. The use of personification emphasises the latent power of the elements. Adam knows that this simple cloud is likely to transform into something dangerous and frightening. Terrible bowl of blackness. This metaphor suggests that Adam has a circular-shaped view of the dark cloud from his house, and that it has a substantial depth to it, like a bowl. Perhaps he is looking for a window or a door. The adjective terrible continues the sense of latent threat from earlier in the paragraph. This expanse of darkness has the potential to wreak horrendous destruction. The abstract noun blackness adds further tension, as this means that Adam will not be able to see clearly when the storm eventually hits. Great canvas of nature. This metaphor implies the beauty of the natural world. The word canvas is typically used to refer to great paintings, and so the sense is that Adam is aware of the sublimity of his natural surroundings. They would be a worthy subject for a famous painting. Meanwhile, the adjective great contrasts to the adjective small from earlier in the sentence. Clearly, human beings are tiny and impotent in relation to the scope and power of nature. Note within these paragraphs how I persistently put the quotations into context. It sounds really obvious, but clearly I cannot use the quotations full of menace without explaining what is full of menace. Time for my quotations from paragraph 7. A swirling mass of water. This phrase suggests that the sea and rain from the storm are producing an enormous destructive quantity of water. Meanwhile, the present participle swirling suggests the erratic, spiralling movements of the water. It is not just coming down from the skies, but from all directions. Crouching apology of a man. The implication here is that the power of the storm has literally resulted in Adam having to shelter towards the ground, with his back lowered to offer a degree of protection. He feels emasculated by the storm, and that his humanity is wretchedly insubstantial and ineffective faced with the power of nature. Like a demented hail of shrapnel, this simile suggests the ferocious, potentially deadly power of the individual rain strikes against Adam's house. Shrapnel is typically used in warfare to kill, and this suggests just how dangerous the rain is, whilst the adjective demented implies that Adam feels there is a terrifyingly crazed aspect to the way the rain is hitting his house, further heightening his fear. A comparison between my response and the equivalent notes in the mark scheme is worth doing. Notice how in my response I'm far more specific about hail, and I also take the time to explicitly state the role played by shrapnel in warfare. By doing this, I'm meeting the criteria in the top band of the mark scheme, in a way in which the brief notes in the indicative content of the mark scheme do not. Time now for you to make a judgment call about the quality of your own response. Reread the mark scheme and give yourself a mark out of 15. We're now on to question 3. For this, I'm going to share with you my planning thought processes, the mark scheme, and my own response. I just want to share with you my thought processes on how best to approach this question. Remember that I have a full video on question 3, which sums up what's required in this question with that wrap: transform, don't translate; develop, don't just state; nail the tone, but don't overcomplicate. Crucially here, I think it's worth spending at least 5 minutes annotating your passage to make sure that you focus on all 3 bullet points and that you extract sufficient information from the text. You can see here that I've set up a color-coded system. Let's go to look then at points which we can use for the first bullet point. What happened to the fisherman? Well, I think you might refer to some of the points here, that prior to the storm, the sky was incredibly black and dark, and he had a sense of foreboding that something terrible was going to happen. It was going to be a particularly violent storm. Lots of details within this section here. Notice the storm is a tempest, so an incredibly strong storm. How did it affect him? It left him cowering, it left him scared. I think we can presume that there's been some damage to his house. Perhaps we can develop this point about the rain smashing to suggest that perhaps some windows got broken during the storm. Other points that we might mention here within this section, we can talk about the sea breaking through, and perhaps we could say, possibly we could develop that further, that the ground floor of his house ended up sort of receiving a lot of water, etc., etc. Let's now go on to the other point here. Why did he refuse to leave? Plenty of points here. He loves it there. Notice his point about the view. He can't live without seeing the sea. We also know why he doesn't leave, because, well, there aren't storms all of the time. Sometimes it's a beautifully calm, flat pond, and he feels a real sense of tranquility. I think he likes being on his own, doesn't he? He likes the fact that he's the human in charge, even if he has little control over nature. He also has a real respect and awe for nature, and that's another reason why he doesn't leave. He likes how nature puts humanity into context. He's also stubborn, and he's got a real sort of fighting spirit in him. He likes to feel that somehow he can survive within this very remote, wild place. Notice that you want to be taking ideas from different sections of the text, and we've got this idea that he almost sees himself as he's in some kind of movie, or he's within some kind of story. He likes the idea of him sort of picturing himself there, battling against nature. And now let's go on to how this will affect. This is the trickier bullet points. You need to be a bit more creative here. Well, I think for this point, I'm going to say that he's going to stay there. And the points I'm going to take from the text are going to be that he has a sense of his own ancestors, and the fact that this place did used to be a vibrant community. So therefore he feels a kind of obligation to stay. But in the future, I'm going to suggest perhaps it's going to be more difficult for him to, I should change colour, so we change that. He's going to find it more difficult with the fish, and he's going to find it harder and harder to catch enough fish to survive. I think I might mention his children here, and perhaps the children are going to stay within the sanctuary at the nearby town, but he's so stubborn that it's more important for him to be at home with nature. And in the future, he's again going to be there, and he's going to be at peace, listening to the sea. We've got this at peace there, so I need to transform that word. But essentially, he's going to stay and continue to battle over the years. So here's what I wrote before seeing the indicative content of the mark scheme. In the early hours of yesterday morning, a single fisherman, Malcolm McDrury, 62, survived a devastating storm in the remote village of Rapness. On Tuesday afternoon, Mr. McDrury reported that the sky went black and that there was a particularly dark cloud above the sea. I knew that a mighty storm was on the way, and so I sent my family to Skelwick to shelter. But there was no way I was going to miss it, he reveals. The storm caused significant damage to Mr. McDrury's cottage. Both front windows were broken, whilst the entire ground level was flooded. Mr. McDrury had taken preemptive action by positioning some of his children's furniture on a higher level. Unfortunately, the intense rain meant that the water levels rose higher than he had anticipated, and so one of the chairs has been ruined. Many readers will struggle to understand why Mr. McDrury didn't join his family in Skelwick. He refuted any suggestion that he had behaved irresponsibly, and instead described his own feelings of awe at witnessing the power of nature firsthand. "Nothing comes close to it," he said. "It reminds me each time how significant we all are. Anyway, I'll be damned if I let any storm stop me from living in the home of my father and our ancestors." He also pointed out that such storms are relatively rare, and there are extended periods of time in which the sea is at peace, meaning that he can fish on relatively calm waters. David Sturgeon, a friend who lives in the nearby village of Skelwick, described Mr. McDrury as particularly obstinate. He added, "We've been trying to tell him for years that he should leave Rapness, but he doesn't take any notice. I suspect he has got too used to being on his own with the sea to change." Moving forward, Mr. McDrury plans to repair the water damage on the ground floor of his cottage and arrange for a glazier to visit from Skelwick in order to repair his broken windows. "I couldn't live anywhere else," he said, "and if my children aren't prepared to stay with me, we'll just have to get used to seeing each other less often." One suspects that Mr. McDrury's battle with the elements will continue until the bitter end. That said, with the increasing scarcity of herrings, it is likely that he will find it harder to sustain himself and maintain his proud independence. "Just me, the sea, the gulls, and my fishing rod," he cried. "I wouldn't have it any other way." How is this marked? Well, 15 marks are available for reading. Here are the top 3 bands. Key points to note within the top band are: you need to have thoroughly evaluated or transformed the text. You need to have developed ideas, not just plonked them. Though, of course, these ideas need to have stemmed from the text and they need to sound right. And you need to have transformed a wide range of points whilst ensuring that you cover all 3 bullet points and that your, in this case, report sounds like a report. Have a look again at my response, which will appear in 5-second intervals. How does it meet the top band of the reading mark scheme? Let's take a few points. Well, the use of time references, place names, human names, ages, speech, and the third person contribute to the consistent and convincing voice. Notice how I have developed the point about the rain smashing itself against the house into suggesting that both front windows were broken. I have also developed the point about the chair and table in a raised corner. Unfortunately, the storm was too strong, meaning that one of the chairs was ruined. I have incorporated plenty of points from the text. Let's see how many different points are included within the paragraph above. We have the reference to his own feelings of awe, which stems from the line in which the fisherman's imagination is awakened. When he talks about human insignificance, this is stemmed from the line about how small he feels on the great canvas of nature. We've also got the reference to his father and ancestors, which stems from the very first paragraph. What about the point about the sea frequently being calm, which was transformed from the line about the water lying like a flat pond. Finally, there is the reference to fishing. And of course, with so many points transformed from the text, we are well on the way to demonstrating a thorough evaluation and analysis of the text. But of course, there are another 10 marks up for grabs in this question for the quality of your writing. Here are the top 4 bands. Within the top bands, you need to nail the tone. You can be asked for this question to produce a letter, a report, a journal, a speech, an interview, or an article. Your writing needs to sound authentic, and so the more you independently read letters, reports, journals, speeches, interviews, or articles, the more successful you are likely to be. Similar to the previous point, your language needs to sound convincing and consistently appropriate. Your ideas need to be expressed in an effective and interesting way. And you need to sequence your ideas logically, use almost invariably short paragraphs, and make sure your accuracy is virtually flawless. Have another look at my response. How does it meet the top band of the writing mark scheme? My response will appear now in 5-second intervals to help you do this. However, remember that the examiner also has some suggested ideas to reference for each bullet point. Here's what is suggested for the first bullet. What I find interesting here is that they have split up the answers into past and present, and clearly expect you to reference some of the past storms mentioned in the first paragraph of the diary entry. I didn't do this in my own response, and given the headline, "Lone Fisherman Survives Storm of the Century," I assume that the examiner only wanted you to focus on the most recent storm. However, this is the advantage of doing past papers. CIE do think in a certain way, and the more you practice, the more you will get an idea of exactly what they're looking for, irrespective of whether it seems a little artificial or illogical. Here is their suggested content for the second bullet point. Press pause to read this through and compare to your own response. And now for the trickier third bullet points. Note that you can choose either that the fisherman stays or that he leaves, but either way you need to include plenty of points which have stemmed from the text to explain your reasoning. Press pause to read these through carefully. Hopefully you should now be in a position to give yourself a mark out of 15 for reading and 10 for writing. Press pause to consider your reading mark. The writing mark scheme will appear in 5 seconds time.
This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare past paper exclusively on the 0500 0990 paper 1, the CIE. I hope it's been useful. Best of luck and many thanks for watching.